Okay, I think we'll make a start. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending our national minimum wage sessions for not-for-profit organisations. My name's Caroline Jones, and I'm a tax director here at BDO, specialising in employment tax for not-for-profit. So I'm really delighted to announce that we've got two speakers today, Dale and Siobhan, and I'll leave them to introduce themselves. But what I would say is that Dale has been with us for just under a year, joined us from HMRC, and Siobhan has been with us for just 5 weeks, joining us from HMRC. So they've both got great insight into HMRC's approach to national minimum wage. So today, Dale and Siobhan are going to look at potential national minimum wage risks for charities. And as we'll see, there are areas that can inadvertently trip organisations up. So it's those complexities that we're going to cover today. So we expect to be finished by 10, and we've allowed some time for questions. So if you have any questions, if you'd like to post them in the chat, what we're going to do is pick them up at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to Siobhan.
Thanks, Caroline. So my name's Siobhan Waters, and as Caroline says, this is week 5 for me at BDO. And today we're going to talk you through, as Caroline said, some risks to do with charities. Dale, can you pop the next slide on for me, please? So we all know that from the 1st of April 23, the national minimum wage rate is due to rise by 9.7%. To £10.42 per hour for workers aged 23 and over, and a similar percentage for those workers aged 22 and younger. We want to look at today how can those be sustainably funded without impacting day-to-day business and inadvertently breaching the national minimum wage regulations. You might already be paying it without realising it, but the additional payments might not be included as part of national minimum wage pay as well. So we're going to highlight some common scenarios and explore some areas where charities in particular can inadvertently fall foul of the regulation. So this is our agenda today. I'm going to hand you over to Dale and he'll give you an overview of the first part.
Excellent, thank you, Siobhan. As Caroline said, I joined BDO just under 12 months ago. From HMRC, and my background from HMRC was looking at the most complex cases that HMRC were enforcing for national minimum wage, and my role there for the 6 years that I was there was to make sure and guide compliance officers to make sure that they're making the right decisions on cases, that they're interpreting the legislation correctly, that they're interpreting HMRC guidance correctly, and that they're applying that consistently across the cases that they are investigating. And so I'll say joined BDO just under 12 months ago in March, and I just want to talk now about the HMRC enforcement activity that we've seen since I've joined BDO. Okay, so before we go on to the potential risk areas that Siobhan will cover shortly, I just want to give an overview of the current enforcement landscape. And as I said, this is what we've seen in my time since I've joined BDO from HMRC. And the top 2 points there, the continuing sector-specific targeting and location-specific focus. Recent reports from the Government and Low Pay Commission have shown that sector targeting is still happening. We expect that to continue over the next 12 months. And the way that HMRC enforced, we've got the sector-specific targeting, we've also got the worker complaints, which is the 3rd point on there, and how HMRC are driving that at the moment is they're encouraging workers to complain by giving them an overview of what NMW rules look like, how that applies to them, what they're entitled to, and giving them a greater overview of what they should be entitled to. And that can kickstart a HMRC investigation just from one worker. That can result in a full review of all workers in that business and potentially associated businesses and groups as well. So for a number of years, the sector targeting has been a key focus for HMRC, and we're now seeing that move into a geographical approach, where HMRC are looking at potentially a geographical area and focusing on businesses within that area, whether they're a small business or large business, regardless of how many workers they potentially employ. And we're seeing that particularly from the recent media reports, we're seeing that in Northern Ireland at the moment. So again, there's 3 different ways there that HMRC are continuing their enforcement. Okay, the 4th point on there, checking salaries up to 30k, and this is likely to increase with the April uplift, as Siobhan said, that the highest ever increase to national minimum wage rates at a 9.7% increase. Historically, we've seen HMRC look at salaries up to 30k. That's likely to increase in April, and there's less leniency on penalties that HMRC apply. You know, in most cases now that we're seeing, if there is an underpayment, HMRC will enforce that 200% penalty in most cases. Alongside that comes the public naming, which has proved successful for HMRC when they're investigating, and again that comes alongside the 200% penalty. We're seeing an increased focus on worker type, which we're not going to touch on in too much detail in this session today, but there are 4 different worker types to be aware of that fall under national minimum wage rules. And what we're seeing at HMRC focus a lot more on applying that consistently and to the letter of the law, if you like, as to how the legislation says that should apply. Siobhan touched on the incorrect treatment of pay elements, which is an area we're certainly going to look at in this session. And voluntary deductions, again, are 2 key areas that we're seeing increased HMRC focus. We have had a couple of questions on salary sacrifices as well, which we'll touch on in the session, but they are the key areas that we're seeing HMRC focus at the moment. So, you know, deductions that a worker may have said, I'm happy for you to take this payment, but the impact on NMW, that's had a negative impact on NMW and brought workers' pay below national minimum wage. On the pay element side of things, which we'll, as I said, we'll touch on further on in the session. But HMRC is certainly looking at that, and it's important from the experience that I've seen in the last 12 months, it's important to get that starting point right for your national minimum wage calculations to make sure that you're compliant going forward. Toil and overtime, again, key area that we're seeing HMRC look at. Again, are your toil policies right? Do you operate a toil policy? Are workers doing additional time that isn't paid for? Is your overtime policy in the right place as well? So again, we'll touch a little bit on that as well further into this session. And increased focus on worker evidence during inquiries. So we are seeing bigger requests from HMRC. They're looking at worker detail, a lot more worker interviews. So as part of an investigation, they'll look at, well, what is happening in practice? What is it that the high level policy says? So what is your toil policy? What is your overtime policy? What are your controls around working time and how you record that? But also looking at what is the workers' understanding of that? What do the workers say is actually happening in practice? And we are seeing an increase in additional worker interviews and a reliance on those worker interviews in the absence of accurate recording records from employers, or missing documentation from employers as well. So, you know, HMRC will use that in the absence of records, or an absence of a particular policy that isn't quite worded correctly. HMRC will give weight to what the workers are saying and use that to make their technical conclusions. Working time and time recording I've touched on slightly there, but that's always been an area that HMRC have challenged, usually around additional time before and after a shift. That continues to be a focus. You know, that those few minutes here and there where a worker's perhaps doing an extra task before they finish for the day, or they're queuing potentially to clock out, or to sign out, or to leave the building at a particular location. You know, it might be a door at the other end of the building, and they've got to get there and use that exit. So it's little bits of time like that HMRC do still enforce, as well as the additional working time that might be, oh, well, you know, I'll just log on for an extra half an hour. Perhaps I'm doing a bit of work from home. I'll stay late and do a bit more to get this particular task finished. So it's what are your control measures around that? how is that communicated to workers, and how do you control that and record that to demonstrate to HMRC that you're paying national minimum wage. And we'll move on to potential risk areas now, which Siobhan will take us through.
Thanks, Dale. So yeah, potential risk areas. So when is a volunteer not a volunteer? So Dale's covered there a few examples of areas where we're seeing HMRC focus on, and a few of those areas might apply to charities depending on the type of workers that you engage as well. A lot of charities do use volunteers, so we thought we would give some detail around where volunteers can ultimately end up not being volunteers, as in the interpretation of the legislation. And this is areas where HMRC will really focus on and pick up on and test as well. So some of the main things to consider then, so you have a volunteer, they need to be, as a true volunteer, have no employment contract or contract to perform work or provide services. They have no expectation of entitlement to pay or any benefits in kind. So they are doing that for the joy of doing the volunteering. They can come and go as they please. So there's no set structure on you have to be here by this time and that time, and no leeway within that. They're under no obligation to provide the service. So again, going back into the fact that they don't have the contract to perform the services. They can have a volunteer agreement. So that would maybe be covering some of the basic requirements of that particular place. So some health and safety regulations, some insurance indemnities. They can be reimbursed for reasonable out of pocket expenses. You know, some reasonable travel expenses, food and drink expenses, and they can receive items of nominal value to recognise their achievements. So T-shirts, hats, pin badges. National minimum wage legislation also recognises the term voluntary worker, and that does differ to a volunteer. And that would be something that HMRC would thoroughly test as well. There are a few differences, and it really is important to have the categorisation of these workers, voluntary workers or volunteers, established. And that just helps there be no shift in that status into an actual worker, and therefore entitlement to national minimum wage applying. So a voluntary worker, they can have an employment contract or contract to perform the worker services. There's specific criteria where a voluntary worker would need to be working for, so they must work for that specific body. So a charity, local community, amateur sports club, there's a few areas that they can be involved in. They can be engaged directly or indirectly through a charity. So directly would be for the charity, and indirectly would be for an event through the fundraising body of that charity. And there are different implications on how you would then treat expenses, which would then alter the status of a voluntary worker, and therefore would change the entitlement to national minimum wage. And it's as simple as having someone who is engaged directly. If they are given the payments to cover their food and drink, that can take the shift into worker status. Whereas if they are just given food and drink on the day of the event, that keeps them in the voluntary worker status as well. There's an element of the voluntary workers as well where they cannot be reimbursed for accommodation, but they could be given that as part of an arrangement. So if the particular thing that they were involved in involved them staying overnight and that accommodation was given as part of their activity, then that keeps them in the voluntary worker status and doesn't cause that shift into worker. However, if they were expected to find their own accommodation and then therefore they were to be given a payment back to reimburse them, that can cause a shift into the worker status. And they cannot be paid more than the expenses in connection to the performance of that. So the travel cost, they have to be paid the amount of money that would reimburse the actual cost. So this is just an example, a bit of a case study that we thought we would go over today, just to give you an indication of how easy it could be to be tripped up and have a shift in a volunteer status. So here we've got business A. You have a volunteer who gives 3 hours of their time every Wednesday for a local charity. And that charity reimburses the volunteer for their £3 bus fare. And that's the actual amount of their travel on the day. because that's direct reimbursement of the volunteer's expense, that would be unlikely to change the status from the volunteer to worker. Now we've got business B, and this volunteer gives the same amount of hours, 3 hours of their time on most weeks, to the charity, but they don't come on the same day, they cover different days. So in return, the charity gives them a weekly bus ticket with a value of £30. So that covers any day that they come in. But because that bus ticket's value is in excess of the actual expense incurred by the volunteer, that could potentially create that contractual relationship where the volunteer is undertaking the work for that reward. And that is something that could then change the volunteer to a worker, and therefore their entitlement to national minimum wage pay. And that's examples that myself and Dale will have seen in our time in HMRC, where applying the legislation, testing the understanding of the volunteers' expectations, looking at any information that would build that picture up, and something like that could really put sway and shift someone's status. Dale, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. I think that's probably a good time, perhaps, just to ask if there are any questions around those case studies or the volunteer slides that Siobhan ran through. You know, you can come off mute or pop a question in the chat if you've got one there. If not, we can move on to the next case study, which will be around pay elements and how different pay can be treated for national minimum wage purposes.
Dale, there's a couple of questions in the chat already. So there's one question here. The examples: a nursery worker who stayed late to weave a willow hut for the outdoor space voluntarily. Now, again, that would come down to the actual worker type. If that was a nursery worker who stayed late to weave that willow hut and they weren't paid for that, there would be testing of that. So it comes down to what would be happened in practice. What's the expectation? What was the reason why they had to do it? Yep. Could someone else have done that? Could it have been done during working hours? There's a lot more that would be added into that to establish if that would be something that would be accepted under not being classed as working time, rather than somebody being staying late to do additional voluntary work. Because in that scenario, the likelihood is that they are engaged as a worker, and therefore the testing of what that time was used for would come under the testing of the person being the worker. If it was something that was a one-off, or if it was something that happened regular, that would also change the way that HMRC would view that as well, and the potential implications of creating an underpayment on that as well. Dale, have you got anything else to add on to that answer?
No, I think you've covered that quite well there, but I suppose it links back to the slide I was talking about, where HMRC will look at what the worker's understanding of that is. So if there is a blur in what the policy is, or what that arrangement is, communication to that individual is also key about understanding what they should be doing at that point, because that's a key determination as to whether that's working time or not. You know, what is it that me as an employer has asked you to do? Does that fit in with what our high level policy is? Does that fit in with the communications that we've had in your contract, in our staff handbooks, etc.? Does all of that tie in, and does the worker understand what working time is, and what is deemed to be you know, the time that they're free to do what they please?
Yeah. And there's another question here as well, we'll just cover as well, because it's quite appropriate for the volunteer side. So keep being asked if we can provide EAP, so employee assistance program services and discounts to volunteers. Is there a real risk with this, because it looks like there could be tax liability and transfer to worker status? Yeah, again, if you can kind of link it back into that case study, and that case study is a very simple example of where someone can, you know, think they're doing something that's helping because they're giving something that covers the cost of the travel, cost to cover different days. It saves, you know, it could potentially save any delay in someone getting that payment. Those types of things are where the risk comes in, that then could create that shift into worker status. So if you're providing employee assistance services and discounts to volunteers, that could then create that contractual relationship, and HMRC, again, with additional questions to that volunteer to establish if their understanding of it is, and their commitment to coming in and doing the volunteering is solely based on the fact that they receive those discounts and those assistance programme benefits, then this becomes something that HMRC would really test to see if that would then entitle them to be paid under national minimum wage as a worker rather than a volunteer. So there is a big risk on that. The key thing for the volunteer part of it is, and again, thinking into the voluntary worker, because we do have to think of them separately under the legislation, there's no expectation of any benefits in kind. There's no expectation of reimbursement. There's no expectation for them to show up. If they, if they don't show up, then that's okay. There's no reprimand on that as well. So some of these things, if you were starting to add them in, if someone then didn't come to do any volunteering for 6 months, would they still be able to receive that benefit? And therefore, they're still getting a benefit of some sort by having maybe done a few volunteering shifts. So there is complexity around that as well. But I think that the key message around that would be, providing anything like that does give a real risk for the shift into worker status, and therefore NMW applies for any hours they do for you.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that, Siobhan, as well. There can be cases that I've seen, both in my experience with HMRC and the work that I've done with BDO to date, where an individual could be a worker for NMW purposes, but not for tax purposes. So it's looking at what is the arrangement there, and that could differ from business to business. What is the arrangement? What is the key documentation and the understanding of what that arrangement is, and what's expected of that individual from an NMW angle could be a different look as to how you would look at that for tax. So yeah, definitely some complexity when whenever you give somebody a benefit, there's always that risk of national minimum wage. So it's worth looking at in some detail if you can. Excellent. Okay, so we'll move on to the second case study then, which is around pay elements. This is a real case, and it highlights the importance of a clear contractual position for your workforce. Siobhan's covered how important it is from a volunteer slash worker perspective, but it's making sure that you understand what could count as NMW pay, to give you that extra protection that perhaps the rate increase may take away in a few weeks' time. So in this case study, we've got the same hourly rates, but different pay for NMW purposes. And this highlights really how important it is to understand what counts and what doesn't count for NMW pay. So business A, we've got a time worker. The worker pay arrangement is £13 an hour for the night shift, £9.50 an hour for the day shift, and they're contracted to work 40 hours per week on both shifts. So you'll see there that the pay for NMW purposes for business A is £380, and the pay for business B for NMW purposes for night workers is 520. So in business A, for all workers, day shift and night shift workers, £380. Business B, the pay for NMW purposes for night workers increases significantly. The reasoning for that is in business A, the contractual position there is that a standard contract covers both the day rate and the night rate. That's in every contract. With business A has that as a standard across the whole business. Whether you're on the day shift or the night shift, you get the same contract. But at the top of the contract, it will say, because you're on the night shift, you get paid £13 an hour. However, the wording in the contract stipulates that if you work a day shift, then you'll be paid £9.50 an hour. Now, even if that worker never works a day shift in the whole time that they're with the business, HMRC in this particular case determined that because the £9.50 rate was stipulated in the contract, amongst other things within the contract, every hour that they worked under that contract would be treated as paid at £9.50 an hour. So the worker got the £13 per hour in their bank account, that was on the pay slip. It was clear that that's the rate that they were paid. They never ever worked the day shift throughout their whole career with the business, but still, for NMW purposes, their pay was £380. So, you know, that's still above national minimum wage. The current rate is £9.50, but in business B, because of the way that contract has been worded, HMRC in that example could determine that £13 an hour is the right rate to use for those workers for all of the hours that they work under their contract. And you can see the significant buffer there that you've got of £520 for NMW purposes. Now, I highlight this mainly because we've had, it's a real life case. We are seeing HMRC target this particular area. You know, it may not be that you pay a different rate for your day or night shift. You might pay additional rates at bank holiday. You may pay additional rates at weekends. You know, you may have different elements that you're using that don't necessarily count for national minimum wage purposes. Now, we have had a couple of questions around salary sacrifice, so I will relate this back to a salary sacrifice example. And if you've operated in a salary sacrifice and you think that your NMW level is X amount per year, actually is that the right amount that you should be looking at when you're considering whether your salary sacrifice brings a worker below national minimum wage or not? So it's getting that starting point for NMW correct that then allows you to comply by making sure that all of the other things that can affect NMW are calculated in the right way. So, you know, that additional buffer may well be, you know, you're aware that people may do the extra shift here, the extra additional time here or there, half an hour here, half an hour there. In business A, you're right on the 950 there. You know, you've not got any wiggle room, any additional working time. You know, even if it's 5 minutes over their shift time, you're already breaching national minimum wage because you're paying bang on £9.50 an hour. There's no additional buffer there for you to play with to give you that extra protection that you may have had previously. Whereas in business B, you've got a lot there to use. So no, we're not saying that workers shouldn't be paid their additional time, but it's looking at from a practical point of view, what can you put in place if you're already making these payments? Does that help you in terms of ensuring that you continue to comply with national minimum wage going forward? Okay. So as Siobhan touched on earlier, depending on the worker type, there are different elements that could count for NMW purposes. So, you know, as I've said a few times now, that the contractual position it needs to be clear, and the correct worker type needs to be established for these pay elements to count. But to run through a few of them that could count as pay, depending on you know, the facts and the contract. As I mentioned, you may have additional pay for working late, working nights. You may have pay for weekends and bank holidays. You may pay overtime at time and a half. You may have additional payments for a particular location. London waiting is always a good one to use as an example. You may have travel allowances that you're paying that could count towards NMW pay. And any other payments or regular payments that you're making above basic pay could count for NMW purposes. So just touching on my experience so far with BDO and the HMRC investigations that we're currently working on, they are tested in detail and can result in underpayments. So, you know, as we touched on in the previous example, if you're using some of these elements and counting that as pay, do they actually count? Is the wording correct in them? Is the worker type correct? To mention that, you know, there are 4 different worker types, and each of those types have different elements that can count in one but don't count in another, and that's one of the key areas that I'm seeing in the clients I'm working with at the moment, where they're not quite meeting the regulations there. However, if the correct processes are used, then a lot of those elements will be included as part of the calculation, and then obviously that then wouldn't result in an underpayment, but it's making sure that the correct application is used, that worker type, the contractual position, and the worker understanding of how these different elements fit into the arrangements. Okay, and before we move on to practical considerations, we might just pause there again for any questions that are in the chat, or any questions that anybody would like to ask.
So we have got a question, Dale, about what are the worker types?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can touch on that. So there are 4 different worker types. Salaried is the first worker type. So that's somebody that is paid an annual salary for an annual amount of hours. And the downfall that I see with clients on my time at HMRC there is that there were very strict criteria for meeting salaried rules. They have changed over the last couple of years to make it easier for employers to understand and to apply that to their workforce. But there are strict criteria that need to be met for that, and HMRC do enforce that to the letter of the law. Time workers is a worker that is paid an hourly rate of pay for X amount of hours. Again, a common one that employers usually get right when they're operating that kind of arrangement. Output, where somebody is paid on the basis of output. So, for example, in a factory, if they're paid based on how many garments they make, X amount per garment, that would fall under output work. And then anything that doesn't fit into any of those 3 fall into an unmeasured category, which is a catch-all for anybody that falls out of those 3. And salaried is probably the most difficult one to understand, and that's where a lot of employers fall down when they're treating them as salaried. They pay them a fixed amount each month, but then they end up becoming unmeasured workers because they don't meet the salaried criteria. And under unmeasured rules, it's similar to time workers. They have to be paid for every hour that they work in a pay period. So if you've got a salaried worker that is working 40 hours a week, Monday to Friday, because the Mondays to Fridays can differ in a particular month, that's where the underpayments can sneak in, because there may be more hours worked in one month that the salary doesn't quite cover, and that's where the underpayments come most commonly for salaried workers. Okay, so I hope that answers the question there. Are there any more questions in the chat, Caroline, or should we move on to practicals?
Yeah, nothing at the moment, so if you can move on to the practical, that would be great.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so practical considerations, we've touched on a few of these. Contracts, ensuring that the wording is clear, especially around pay elements, and making sure that doesn't inadvertently create a potential issue for NMW. We talked about the additional pay elements that you might be including in your calculation, but don't actually count under NMW rules. Policy and overtime, toil and overtime. So ensuring that your overtime policy is clear on when that applies. Toil around time off in lieu, toil around when that time needs to be taken back. So one of the key areas that employers tend to fall foul of in that area is that they earn toil in month 1 and don't take that back until month 3 or 4. Now, again, depending on the worker type, that toil needs to be taken back at a certain period, either in the pay period that it's earned or the one after that in most work types. and only Salaried really allows that toil to be carried forward further than that. So again, it's looking at those policies. If you've not got salaried workers, and you perhaps got time workers that do take toil or do accrue toil, it's how your policy is set around that. And it may be that your high level policies are great and the business is clear on that. It's often local arrangements that potentially are in operation that the business isn't quite aware of. And again, it comes back to that piece around speaking to workers around what's happening in practice, where that can cause potential issues. So it's looking at your policy, but also looking at what are your local policies around how toil should operate, and what does the business, what overview does the business have of that. Pensionable pay is a consideration. So if elements are not consolidated into standard pay, then HMRC can review that and decide whether it forms part of NMW pay or not. For example, if you always pay 50 pence per hour extra each week or each month, but that's not consolidated into standard pay, can you consolidate that to give you that buffer we spoke about in the pay elements case study? But again, it's a consideration for the business. One, can you consolidate it? Two, do you want to consolidate it? Because then that could increase your pensionable pay. So it's considering that and weighing up whether that's a benefit worth looking at. Recruitment and job adverts. So it's being clear in your advert around pay, what elements make up that pay. In the example that we had with the case study, the pay in the advert was separated out to say, your day shift is this, your night shift is that. In the 50 pence per hour extra example that I spoke about just a second ago, in the job advert that said, your basic pay is £9.50. You will get an extra 50 pence per hour because of the role that you're doing. HMRC did look at that job advert, and they decided that extra 50 pence didn't count because it was separated out from the basic pay. So again, it's looking back at your pensionable pay and your consolidation. Do you consolidate that into one amount and say your pay is £10 an hour? Is that clear in your advert? Is that clear in the job description? Because right at the top of the session, I spoke about the additional information that HMRC are requiring now during inquiries. They will look at those kind of things, job adverts, job descriptions, contracts, worker testimony are all playing key parts in HMRC's decision making. Okay, and I think Siobhan is going to take us through the payslip design and pay reviews.
Yeah, thanks, Dale. So just touching on what you've already covered there, Dale, the payslip design, using that 50 pence example is really useful, because again, if that 50 pence is always paid, but it's shown on the payslip as a separate amount, again, that gives grounds for HMRC to conclude that is not part of their pay, even if they're paid it for every hour. It's been paid every week since day dot they started. So we would recommend that people review the payslip design so that, again, that doesn't inadvertently cause an issue for HMRC to use as an element that doesn't form part of the overall NMW pay. Annual pay reviews. So you know that when the rate rises or when an age bracket changes, most people have payroll software which will indicate these key points throughout a year. But we would really recommend that annual pay reviews are looked at, not just for those that are impacted by a rate rise, those that are on national minimum wage pay. That's because there's so many elements, as we've covered, that do make up your overall pay. Certain salary sacrifices, bearing in mind this increase that's coming in, if someone's pay is not increased as a reflection of the same percentage as what national minimum wage is, and they are on a salary sacrifice scheme, that reduces the buffer where you have that element that wouldn't bring them below national minimum wage. So we would really recommend pay reviews for all people that are you know, within an element of, as we've said earlier on, £30,000 is where HMRC would look at. We would expect that might go up to at least 35,000. You know, someone on £35,000 a year, you might not think could fall foul of NMW, but there's so many elements that HMRC would take into consideration. Salary sacrifice is a big one that we know from experience. HMRC will really test on that as well. Comms to your workers. So again, we explained at the start of this that HMRC investigations can be as a result of worker complaints. Now, that can be one worker that makes that complaint, and that investigation is opened up across all workers, across the whole business, across all sites, branches, across all of the group. We've seen that before as well, where the investigation extends right out across the full group of a business due to the practices being the same in each setup. Having clear communications with your workers gives them that information that they can then see what makes up their pay. They then have an understanding of elements which impact their pay, and it gives them certainty and could potentially stop a worker complaint to HMRC. And we spoke earlier on about the volunteers as well. Comms to the volunteers, given that expectation at the start, you know, what a volunteer's role is, and making sure that you then cover yourself so that you don't end up inadvertently making a volunteer fall under a worker category. So a few things to consider that should hopefully keep things in line for any potential HMRC review. Dale, I think that's us covered everything, unless you have anything to add on this.
No, that's great, Siobhan. We are going to move on to the Q&A, but we did have a couple of questions that we had in advance. Caroline, if you're able to share those with us.
I think we've probably covered the one off actually, because that was in relation to salary sacrifice and how you take that into account. Yeah. So if you could just run through that again, Dale, that would
absolutely.
be really useful.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the questions we had, as Caroline says, was around salary sacrifice and how that impacts national minimum wage pay. And there was a question around why salary sacrifice impacts national minimum wage pay. So I will just touch on this. Salary sacrifice isn't actually a term that's recognised in the legislation. So the way that HMRC look at salary sacrifice is because you're reducing the salary that you're paying to a worker, you're essentially reducing your starting point for national minimum wage. So where we spoke about elements, etc., that may not count as NMW pay, salary sacrifice works in that similar way for national minimum wage purposes. So for example, if you're paying somebody 20k a year, and they sacrifice £1,000 of that for pension or whatever that might be, whether that's a benefit that might apply to a worker, whatever the reason for that sacrifice is, isn't taken into account for HMRC. They just look at you had 20k, you've sacrificed £1,000, your new salary or your new starting point for national minimum wage is the 19,000 a year. If you're paying that as a salary by 12, then divide that by 12, and that's your monthly starting point. Same for if you're paying weekly. That's salary sacrifice just amends the starting point for your calculation.
Thank you, Dale. There was another question that we had in advance, so perhaps I could address this to you, Siobhan, and that's any information on employing casual workers. So there seems that there's a bit of a fine line between volunteers and workers.
Yeah, so a casual worker under NMW legislation would be entitled to be paid national minimum wage for the work that they would be engaged in. I think, Dale, you touched on it earlier on as well. You can have people that under legislation are classed as workers for national minimum wage, but they may have their own tax and national insurance to look at, so they would effectively be self-employed for tax and national insurance purposes. So there is an element of, again, some of the things we've covered, how is that person engaged? Are they engaged for a particular piece of work? Are they able to send a substitute if they cannot commit to doing that work themselves? Is there someone who's regularly recording work with you? And again, a lot of that depends on what's happening in practice and what HMRC would look to be doing. But again, considering some of the things that would impact, you know, an element of the volunteer, what are you offering in return? Would that then inadvertently create that contractual relationship, and therefore under the legislation they would be entitled to national minimum wage for all hours that they are worked on as regular a basis as they are doing it as well.
Thank you, Siobhan. So there are a few questions in the chat now, so I'll get through as many of them as I can, and if we can't address them now, we can always come back when we send the slides out. So first one, we've heard from HMRC that uniform policies can lead to a risk of a breach. For example, requiring staff to wear black trousers or even banning rips and transparent fabrics. Is this always the case? So not sure which one of you wants to take that.
I can take that one.
We can fight over that because it is a really common.
I'll take this one only because I've had a recent case that is looking at this issue. It isn't always the case that uniform requirements will reduce national minimum wage pay. It's considering what does the worker have to do to comply with the policy. So if there's an expense that they have to go out and purchase something new to comply with the uniform policy, then that can reduce pay. Again, it depends on when they do that. If they do that before employment or whether they do that after employment, it can depend on whether they've worked any hours in that particular week that they go make that purchase. But the crux of it is, and the takeaway on this point is that any expense that a worker has to incur because the employer is asking them to do something, whether that's uniform, it could be tools are always a good example, that can have an impact on national minimum wage pay. And it depends on, as I say, when they do it, and it depends on what that policy is and whether that policy is always enforced.
Thank you. Okay, another question. We're looking at providing accommodation to staff, but we can't see a way not to run into national minimum wage issues. Do you have any suggestions? That's quite a hard one, isn't it?
Yeah, I'll take it. I'll take that one. That's fine. Yes, that there are ways that you can do that. It's probably one that we follow up with you separately offline to look at your individual arrangements. But there are different ways that you can do that. Again, I assume you're looking at accommodation that's potentially above the accommodation offset. If you're not sure what the accommodation offset is, that is an amount of pay that the rules state the accommodation must be below. It's a difficult question because there are different rules that apply as to whether, if you make a charge for the accommodation, if you provide it for free, there are different rules that apply. So the short answer is yes, there are ways to comply, but it's probably one that we take offline to look at the specific detail around.
Thank you. How can we determine if someone is a salaried or timed worker? Siobhan, would you mind taking that?
Yeah, again, there's a lot of complexities around this. It comes down to the contract at the start as well. Salaried workers, the salary has to be for the amount of annual hours as well. And what we see a lot of, and what HMRC will be looking at, is does that contract state that you will be paid X amount for X amount of annual hours? And that's not very commonly seen in contracts. What would then be asked of an employer would be, how will you ascertain those hours? So how would you ensure that that salary that you're paying covers the correct amount of hours that worker is working in a particular year? Again, there's certain elements that would then come into that as well, and again, working around the contract. So if someone is said, you will be expected to work 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, additional hours may be required at the weekends. If you've not got records to show that and you have no way of ascertaining those annual hours, it would potentially be, along with other elements, something that HMRC would tip someone into being not a salaried worker by the definition of the legislation. A timed worker should be paid for all hours worked at their rate of pay per hour for every hour that they work within a pay reference period. And that would be something that, again, would be in the contract, and it would be stated to show, you know, you will be paid £10.42 for 20 hours of work per week. And that would be something that HMRC would really be looking at as well. And again, they test this understanding with the employers. Again, a lot of complexity around that, and might be something that we would want to look at in a bit more specific detail, and something that maybe we can look at putting out some examples on as well.
Thanks, Siobhan. I think it could almost make a session in itself, couldn't it?
It really could, yeah, and it's probably something that we could do. But again, again, from myself and Dale's experience and the cases that we've seen internally at BDO and when we were previously in HMRC, we know the elements of testing, and you can have two businesses that are doing, you know, the workers are doing the same hours for the same rate of pay, and it's just that difference in the contract and the wording of that can tip one into being, you know, breaching the NMW legislation and taking someone out of what we would think of being as a salaried worker into having to be reviewed as something else. And the knock-on impact of getting that worker type wrong, then that's where your pay elements come in, that's where your salary sacrifice comes in, you know, it all starts to build up on that picture. So getting that correct at the start is key on that as well.
Thank you. Okay, so what's the distinction between a volunteer and an intern?
So I can maybe cover this one as well. So in the National Minimum Wage legislation, the term intern is it's not part of the legislation, not recognised. It's a word that's used quite often in different industries, more commonly than others. Again, there is a bit of testing that needs to be done around the status of that. So someone can actually be a volunteer, but the advert that's been put out or the recruitment of that person that's come into the business has been for an intern, and the testing of what is actually happening in practice would then determine if they would be a volunteer or an intern. The HMRC process against this is they would really test the status on that as well. So they would be looking to make sure, you know, all the different elements that are making up what that person is doing. And again, it could be something that they then find that they are neither volunteer nor intern, and ultimately they determine they are a worker as well. We do see quite a lot of people taking up these opportunities as they are linked into their kind of further education. An intern doing some work as part of their degree is something that I've seen examples of that where that's been formed part of their degree, and it's something that they have to do as part of that degree. However, the conversation when someone has been speaking to the employer is, do you have any interns? They say, yes, we've got someone, they're our intern. And actually they would potentially be looked at then as being required to go through the status check, and in actual fact they might not necessarily have needed to do that. So again, it's around the wording and the understanding of that, because under the legislation, intern isn't something that's recognised, and it falls down to what are they doing, and the status test would be done in that case.
Thank you, Siobhan. Last question then, I think we've just got time. Our business wants to start charging employees a fee if they damage a works van and it's their fault. So they want to charge them the insurance excess. Can we do this if the employee agrees in the contract, or will that come into NMW?
Yeah, so there is a part of the legislation that looks at this kind of thing around discipline, and it being a result of the worker doing something that they shouldn't have done that has caused a cost to the business. Again, it's going to come down to, as you say in the question, what's in the contract. Does it cover that eventuality in the contract? Does it say in the contract how much would be charged? Does it cover the strict criteria around when does that apply? Who does it apply to, and when would that be enforced? So I think it comes down to what's in your contract, what is the policy, when do you take it, and how much do you take? Does the amount that you take warrant the amount that it's cost the business to repair the van, for example?
Okay, thank you. So that was our last question. Thank you. Dave, if you could just go on to the very last slide. I just wanted to sum up. First of all, by thanking Dale and Siobhan for what I think was a really informative session. I know there's been a lot covered there, but what I took away from it is that there are lots of complexities around national minimum wage. Working time is really important to record, even if it's a small amount, it needs to be considered. And volunteers can be an issue if they're not just reimbursed for their travel costs. I think something that came out from the questions as well is how important it is to get the worker type right, because that will depend very much on what you can take into account when you're considering national minimum wage. And then the final thing that I would say is that HMRC do use different sources of information, and I think Dale alluded to that earlier. They have been encouraging, for example, apprentices to go to them if they think they haven't been paid the right amount. So they are having sort of campaigns at the moment to make sure that everybody's aware what they should be paid, and if they think they're not, that they contact HMRC. And I think it was Siobhan who said, if you get something, you know, if you get a whistleblower like that, then HMRC are obliged to look at you. So I hope that's been really helpful. Thank you all for attending. We will be sending the slides out as we said, and on this slide we've just put some forthcoming information about things that you might want to attend in the future. But once again, thank you very much for attending, and I hope you have a good day. Thanks then.